everyone. I'm excited to be here today. So, what is communication? It's not a thing that we can see or smell or touch. It's invisible. So, how do we know what communication is? So, raise your hand if you've heard this phrase before. All models are wrong, but some are useful. Figured this is a DDD conference, right? Another way to say this is everything in my head is a made-up concept. Everything in my head is a model. For example, orange. Orange is a made-up concept. Like this whole thing with slicing oranges into wedges and all that, we just made this up. We have these experiences in the world, and we make up concepts to make sense of our experiences. Orange is a made-up concept. Every orange is a made-up concept. Every orange is a made-up concept. All right, we have these symbols and ideas. So why is it useful to make up concepts? And if you think about what we're doing here, we're organizing ideas by similarities and by differences so that we can see these things and make observations, right? So a useful model helps us see, make sense, and make decisions. So going back to all models are wrong and some are useful, another way to say this might be everything in my head is an orange, and our vocabulary of oranges ought to be useful. So going back to our original question, what is communication? Let's see if we can answer this. So first thing we do, we want to know the answer to a definition of something. We ask the internet, right? So the internet says, communication is the act of conveying meanings from one entity or group to another through the use of mutually understood signs, symbols, and semiotic rules. So how often does this actually happen, though, that your orange is the same as my orange, right? This whole idea of mutually understood, how often does that actually happen? Other than math, maybe? So what if we ask the flip side question, what is communication breakdown? Maybe we can understand what communication is by understanding how it breaks. So what is communication breakdown? Well, we've got these people that are talking to each other, and then the communication stops working, something kind of like that, right? The thing is, we experience this wordless space. And in this wordless space, we've got invisible but very real dynamics. But we can't understand what we can't see. We have to kind of put some kind of shadow behind it to see and understand what it is. So what if we orangify communication? To orangify, to make real with shapes. So my goal today is to share a domain model for communication itself and introduce this universal scale modeling language I'm calling Twilight Orange, and the name will make more sense as we get into this. So I've been doing some work collaborating with my good friend Michael Feathers on modeling anatomy of invisible systems. And so if you take systems with similar dynamics, say we got system A and system B here, and the way we describe invisible systems a lot of times is through metaphor, right? And one of the things he started noticing was this pattern of people using system A as a metaphor for B, and system B also as a metaphor for A. And when you have this type of relationship, it says something about the similarity of the underlying systems. And so we started describing these things as forms. So a form characterizes the similarity across systems in terms of explicit structure and forces. And so if you start down this road of defining new forms, defining these invisible things, I found that we needed a poetic license. So this is my official poetic license to deviate from strict fact or rules for expressive effect. But if you're going to do this, got to follow this first principle of our vocabulary of oranges ought to be useful, right? But we can make up words, make up concepts, because it helps us communicate these ideas, right? So Twilight Orange. If we think about our seeing as a function in Twilight Orange, I'm going to talk about seeing the structure of communication, seeing the scope of oranges in a conversation, seeing domain events in a conversation, and seeing thoughts in space. And we'll talk about all of these things of how do you see through this lens of Twilight Orange, or this way of seeing. And then we'll finish up and wrap this up and talk about next steps. All right, so seeing the structure of communication. So imagine your team as a network, and then oranges are these messages on the wire, passing oranges back and forth. And as a software team, you can imagine we've got this software idea sculpture, and we've got oranges flowing into and out of our software. So I've got an idea in my head, and I want to mold the code like clay to kind of represent that idea in my mind. Or there's an idea represented in the software, and I want to get that into my mind, right? And so we've got this flow of oranges between our minds and what's going into the software. But the communication patterns aren't arbitrary. We're building towards something. We're solving a problem of how do we get to some place, right? We're going somewhere. So if I think back to one of my heroes, Albert Einstein, he had this wisdom around design thinking. If you're familiar with this quote, if I had an hour to solve a problem and my life depended on the solution, I would spend the first 55 minutes determining the proper question to ask. For once I know the proper question, I could solve the problem in less than 5 minutes. And I started thinking about, what does this really mean to spend all this time determining the proper question? What factors accelerate the rate of our ability to solve a problem? So if you imagine your team is solving a puzzle, we can watch the movie of us solving this puzzle here and how we're going to solve this problem together. So each person on our team has unique eyes with the capability to see and reason from a vantage point that no one else can see. So if we throw a problem up on the board that we're going to figure out, and each person starts seeing different pieces of the puzzle, right? And eventually, we realize there's an elephant in the room. Eureka! How did he get there? So now Einstein comes in and leads the little retro, and the screen you see goes, and he asks, what is the question that leads me to the question, that leads me to the question, that leads me to the question? Back up, back up, back up. And then he asks, how could we have accelerated the rate of appearance of the elephant? It's a great question because it leads us into deconstructing the process of seeing into functions. So we've got these two pieces of the elephant that we see from different perspectives. And then when we fuse those ideas together, it leads to new vectors of questioning. So if we look at and think about what is the chain reaction that leads to the seeing, well, we see similarities and differences, then we integrate that seeing, we see more things, we integrate that, and we have this chain reaction of seeing that eventually leads to this breakthrough insight. So if we think about all the people on our team, we can accelerate the rate of problem solving with this capability of being able to see together. And our differences in seeing accelerate insight, but only if we're able to share ideas. So this gives us a general notion of better, of which way is up. How do we improve our problem-solving capability as a group? And we've got all these different challenges to solve in order to be able to see together. So now imagine that we've got multiple teams. How do we solve problems together at scale? And as we've been talking about all day, these problems start to get really hard when you add a whole lot more people to the puzzle, right? So an article my friend Michael wrote on orange code basically describes designing oranges as these encapsulated structures. And we can use this concept of an orange. You think about an orange has skin and it's got these different parts in it. And we can organize our software like an orange. And we can think about these same principles when we're designing and thinking about our socio-technical communication systems. So quick story here. Back in 2009, I was working on the dream team. Essentially, leadership strategy of the company was hire all the awesomest engineers you've ever worked with, put them all in the same team, and give them the hardest problem. And so this became this thing where we were all calling our friends, going, we're getting the band back together, everyone, you know? And it was so much fun getting the opportunity to engineer the dream of continuous delivery platform that we put together. And we did something different. As all these communication problems came up, we started designing APIs between all these teams and solving all these problems and structuring the ways that we communicated. And we built this amazing engineering organization. It's one of the best places I've ever worked. And then there was a leadership change. And we had all these problems with communication breakdown and this emergent culture of command, control, and all these political battles. And communication just started going haywire. We're going to shuffle all the teams around, mix people up, and we'll solve these problems of communication with letting everyone talk to everyone else, right? It doesn't scale very well. And I watched this, Ferrari of a project we put together just get crushed and eventually lead to, the great exodus of engineers. It was kind of sad, heartbreaking, eventually drove me to rage write a book. But if we think about Conway's law, an organization is constrained to produce designs which mimic the communication structures. And what happened here, when the communication got all chaotic, when all these political battles started getting in the way of us being able to do effective work anymore, we lost this orangey nature we had of these encapsulated communication structures. And if we think about what the function of these oranges are, the oranges encapsulate this complexity to give us economies of thought. So if I imagine I'm thinking about a problem and I've got a limited capacity window to think about things, I've got this thought work that needs doing. And the rate of thought work is constrained by the number of oranges we can think about at one time, right? And so we have to zoom out away from the details to be able to think at a higher level of abstraction. So I want to be able to push things to other teams and not have to think about them and simplify the interface of the things that I do have to think about. And we basically need to be able to orangify our communication structures in order to scale. And once those boundaries break, you start to realize how important it is to manage all the dependency type of coordination that has to happen and formalize processes around how you're going to do all that kind of stuff. So one of the things I found that's really useful is we can think about oranges as this concept that gives us universal scale with this key property of being able to zoom away from the complexity. And so if I start with a metaphor, system metaphor of a network of oranges, poetic license, right? And we zoom into an orange, then imagine yourself looking inside of the portal. What do you see? Another network of oranges, right? So instead of turtles all the way down, this is so old school, right? We're going to say oranges all the way down if you're cool, right? All right. So this is a structure of communication. You can think of this universal scaling oranges as these abstractions, levels of abstractions in our organization and communication structures. All right. So that's the structure of communication. So seeing the scope of oranges. So imagine you're in a retrospective discussion. Someone's like, well, what are we talking about? It's an imprecise question, right? So one thing you can do, open a meta sidebar. Let's call out meta sidebar. What's the scope of oranges for this discussion? We can talk about the scope of oranges in a lot of different ways. We can talk about different scales. Are we talking about team scale or are we talking about organization scale? We can talk in different contexts. Are we talking about me and my code or code-to-code relationships? And we can also talk at different time scales. So we can talk about things in days, weeks, years, or are we talking about human evolution time scales, right? We want to be on the same page. And the same page basically starts with the same orange scope. So if you listen and hear people talking at different levels of abstraction, different scales, different scopes, help everyone get on the same page with the same scope of oranges. All right. Next, seeing domain events in a conversation. All right, so this is where I started thinking about using color as a metaphor to compress a lot of information and context to make it easy to visualize, and thinking about an orange being wrapped up in being augmented with color information. So on one side of the spectrum, we've got discord and emotional intensity associated with discord. And on the other side, we've got resonance, okay? So now imagine listening on a conversation that's barely audible, so you can't really hear the words, and it just sounds kind of like music. And you can watch these people from a distance talking and listen to the music of the conversation. So here I'm saying some talky words, and Sally responds with discord. And what do? Then I have the same sort of adjustment too. I start responding with discord too. And the same thing that can happen the other way. So Sally might have a look on her face that's like, this isn't quite right. This doesn't agree with things in my head. I must defend my point of view, whatever it is, right? And the opposite can happen too, right? Sally might also respond with lots of resonance, where Sally might be like, oh, that fits so well with my experiences. That's exactly what I was thinking. You just read my mind, right? That's the opposite. So we can find domain events by listening for changes in music in the conversation. So if you listen to the patterns in music over time, and we have these shifts in conversation for resonance and discord, you can kind of think of those moments in time as a domain event in the conversation that you can give a name, right? And no matter what the complexity is of the conversation, you can say, there was a change in the music right here. What caused that? So the process of coding is also like a conversation. So this is my book, Idea Flow. Like I said, I wrote a book, How to Measure the Pain in Software Development, because I was trying to make these invisible problems visible. And if you imagine a developer having a conversation with the code, with the computer, we can have friction in that conversation. So flow in this case, I'm borrowing for the lean idea of flow, but mapping this to communication systems. So flow is the art and practice of seeing, understanding, and reducing friction. And the way we started doing this was visualizing our experience with the code with a tool like this. So for example, when I hit an unexpected observation, and then eventually the problem is resolved, this is 5 hours and 18 minutes of troubleshooting. Would you all agree that's pretty painful? So this became kind of our definition of pain that we wanted to figure out how to reduce. And if we wanted to understand that, we needed to understand the cause. And so as we were thinking about this, the amount of pain then was caused by two factors, right? The likeliness of something unexpected happening and the cost to troubleshoot and repair those issues. And so we could start looking at these dynamics in 2 dimensions of risk. And so we started breaking down all these things into different patterns and giving them actual names. And what we found as we did this is most of the pain was actually caused by human factors as opposed to problems inside the code itself. So for example, stale memory mistakes. This is when I have an idea in my head about how code is supposed to work, but it doesn't work that way anymore because somebody changed it. Or ambiguous clues. This is when you're running an experiment and there's multiple possibilities for how behavior can occur, and you make a bad assumption, and down the rabbit hole you go, troubleshooting for hours the wrong direction. So these aren't really problems inside the code itself. All this pain has to do with these interaction factors with the code. Or the way I started to think about it is pain occurs during this process of understanding and changing the software. And so we started optimizing for what I call idea flow, or this flow of ideas between the developer and the software, as opposed to optimizing the code itself. And this idea of friction measures the percent of our capacity that we spend on resolving discord. And you can add that up across your whole team and figure out what your biggest problems are. So we also started this technique of idea flow mapping. So if I've got an idea in my head and I'm trying to get that into the computer, I can kind of use a sequence diagram sort of format to understand that flow. So let's go through one of these to give you an example. So I'm explaining an idea to a computer, and imagine we're kind of having a conversation with the machine. So I explain to the computer to calculate factorial, multiply all the numbers together up to that number. What does our computer say? Okay, code compiles. All right, I'm going to run a test. Well, what's the factorial for? Computer says 6. What? How'd you get 6? So then we start going and looking around and investigating, and the computer says 1 times 2 times 3 equals 6. But now we can see the problem, right? So we fix it. I meant to include 4, fix the code, communicate that idea, run the test again. Computer says 24. All right, yay, I got that idea that I had. I expressed that and got it into the code, in the conversation. So now what I want to do here, as opposed to thinking about when the tests are turning red and green, think about the state of the human during this whole process, okay? So just because a test is red doesn't mean we're necessarily confused. So if you're doing test-driven development, for example, you start with a red test. The test fails. Are you confused? No, it's exactly what you expected, right? We're not in a state of discord. The red test is what we expected, right? So we're starting an intention as our first event. Then at this point of confusion, we started calling these the WTF events. And the yay events are when we resolve that discord. And then here I finish the intention. So we can think about these different bands of time as this period where we're in a state of resonance and this period when we're in a state of discord. And as we're working through these intentions, we run into friction relative to this thing that we're trying to do. So an intention characterizes the goal that the system moves towards. The way I think about this is I've got a target intention is like this box that I'm trying to fill up. And I've got an idea seed that I start with, and then I'm growing that into this intention. And so I'm always seeing and looking and observing what's going on, and then I flow in a particular direction, which I think about like a steering wheel, and I'm steering my way to the goal. So if we think about this from a context of a team in an idea flow network, each person has the capability to make decisions this way, to see and to flow, to see and to flow. And we're moving together towards some sort of shared intention. And the friction is in the wires running against the direction we're moving, right? It's friction relative to a movement. And together, this is our combined capability to evolve an idea sculpture toward a shared intention, okay? So now imagine a team design discussion. We've got these 5 people in the room, and I want to say something. When I talk to my team, I don't really talk to anyone in particular, right? I speak to the center of the room, right? And then various people respond in different ways. And remember, our goal is to optimize our problem-solving capability and leverage this fact that we all see differently. That's a cool thing, right? We can see this problem. We can have this conversation and look at things from 5 different angles. It's not awesome, right? But how does the number of people in the room actually affect our productivity or affect our ability to do useful work? So let's talk about the productivity of a conversation. So here I have me and Sally, and we're working directly together on this design discussion. And here we've both got different ideas, and we can throw our ideas up on the whiteboard and work together to make progress on this design discussion. And in this context, we've both got deep familiarity with the problem space. We've got a shared language. And what happens is this magic power of 2, where you've got an engine, effectively, you create with 2 people where you amplify the discord between you with having dissonance in your ideas, and on the same time, you converge in terms of resonance. This creates a little creative spark engine, if you will, for figuring out how to solve our problems, right? Then we have a domain event. A person enters the room, and there's this music change, right? Now there's this discord. Well, why is there discord? There's this kind of socially awkward moment here because this person walked in on what kind of feels like a private discussion. It wasn't meant that way, but when there's more than 2 people around, the socially appropriate thing to do is to talk to the center of the room, right? And so as in response to that discord, the humans basically adjust, and you see that this new event of recalibration, and that person is relieved because now we're in more normal social situation. Another domain event, this person starts getting anxious, okay? Dropping out of the conversation, and we can feel their anxiety. Well, why is this person anxious? This new person is less familiar with the problem we're talking about. Instead of shared language, here's a bunch of jargon, feels out of sync from the group. So what do the people do? they adjust, right? So we have this recalibration. Well, we'll adjust our language so that it works for everybody that's in the room. Now, what happens when we've got even more people in the room, right? Same kind of adjustments we make. And so the way I think about this when we make these adjustments is this concept of floor resonance, in that we talk to the least common denominator of shared context so that everyone in the room can participate in the conversation. And we do this just out of matter of social norms. But depending on what we're trying to do, the familiarity level of the people in the room, how much deep familiarity you need to be able to make progress on the thoughts, all of these different factors can have a huge effect on whether you're able to have a productive conversation. And with more people, you've got more discord. But can we really make progress if we can't resolve that into some kind of commonality then, right? So we've got this engine dynamic, and you can think about what's our rate of thought work, and how is that affected by more people in the room with different ideas, and those adjustments to a shared floor resonance so that the people can understand. Is this setup for this particular context are we adding more people than makes sense for this particular conversation we need to have? Do we need more discord in this conversation so we can get more variety of ideas? We can think about all of these factors when we're making decisions on what would be the appropriate thing to do for this particular context, right? But it's going to be a context-specific thing. But you can think about how those different people are fueling that engine. All right, so that's seeing domain events in a conversation, looking for those musical changes, whether it's interaction with the code or interaction with your team. Same thing can happen. You can look for those changes in the music. All right, seeing thoughts in space. So imagine that you can watch the thoughts inside of Sally's brain. As we're talking here, we can see the resonance and stuff happening in her brain. All right, so let's zoom in here. And these oranges, they're different concepts that are related to each other. Now again, poetic license. Imagine the music creating ripples now in water. Okay, so we've got these harmony and discord effects that are making ripples in the water. Now shift your gaze 180 degrees out of phase, so you don't really see the oranges anymore. You're just looking at the wires, looking at the music generated from all the different wires, and then turn the wires into oranges. Okay, so we're going to orangify all the wires that are all actually the same type. And so this is where I got this concept of an abstraction of a twilight orange as this musical magnetic force that allows for push and pull based on the amount of discord or resonance. So take these twilight orange wires and imagine these wires floating freely in the water, and so they can move around in space. So what happens now when a thought resonates in Sally's brain? So here I'm talking, and initially, the resonance from pulls Sally's attention to this particular thought. And then we get these ripple effects where resonance cascades and pulls other related thoughts. And then the biggest ripples you can imagine in the water determine the thoughts that end up coming to mind. And remember, now these things can move in space. So when two things are in sync, they pull together. And when two things are out of sync, they push apart. So here we had two things that resonated with discord, but those things kind of get pulled together. And now the thoughts can self-organize into groups. So in sync, you have this group by similarity effect, and out sync, you have separate by difference effect. And so what you get is this emergent organization of these groupings, of these center of the room type effects, but at a level of thoughts. We can kind of summarize things in this new way and get these emergent constructs. And again, this is another universal scale pattern, but having to do with the relations. But this pattern can work at any level of abstraction. You notice teams too. You'll also see this dynamic of people pulling together and pushing apart. So the way I started thinking about this communication dynamic is these twilight oranges on the wire are actually motivating forces on the wire. So we say an idea, we express a thought, and the thought we express is wrapped up in all this motivated context, right? Our expressions aren't merely a plain old word referring to a plain old object. We've got all kinds of thoughts and feelings and things wrapped up in our experiences of this that we're communicating in this undercurrent of conversation. We're communicating whether your idea resonate with mine or whether I have disagreement with those things all the time, right? And if we outsync and disagree a lot, that a lot of times those kinds of things can introduce a whole new set of political battle craziness that happens within our organizations, right? So pay attention to whether you're communicating in sync or out sync and how those dynamics are affecting people in your organization. And when I started thinking about these thoughts mapped in space, I found this really helpful way to represent this information. So we think in spectrum, think in terms of these Twilight Spectrum maps. You can take your center of focus, whatever that is, put it in the center of map, and then all the things you're talking about in conversation, you can map them in terms of frequency and then adjacency in space. We can put these things in groups of stuff that's related to one another. So you're having a conversation about all these different things related to this topic in your group, being able to quickly visualize those things and have an understanding of these are all Discord-related things that are really intense or not so much. You can quickly make decisions about what sort of areas you want to focus on in the conversation with just a really simple visualization tool. All right. So that's seeing thoughts in space. So what's next? So this was my goal, right? Is to communicate this domain model for communication. And we learned lots of new words, right? But this gives us a shared language to have meta conversations about conversation. The other thing I wanted to point out is this model, this twilight orange, basically looks like the same structure as the magnetic forces of our Earth. And my theory is that life force, this motivation force that creates this richness of life, living systems at all scales exhibit very similar sorts of emergent patterns. And if you look at complexity theory and cognitive science and social sciences and physics, there's this convergence of ideas on what looks like a universal function. And my belief is this universal function is actually quite simple. It's basically a twilight orange. But what do we actually do with this? Right? One of the nice things about having this be a model of living systems is it can apply at universal scale. It can apply to all of these things we have to do that have to do with human systems, living systems. And so you can start conversations about the conversation, paying attention to the changes in music, paying attention to the sound of discord, and whether the discord is fueling the rate of thought work or it's just pushing people apart, causing problems. And we can start having these meta sidebar conversations about oranges and help people get on the same page and start repairing all of these challenges with communication breakdown. And the thing is, we need multiple ways of seeing. I got oranges, you got oranges, right? But what if we put our oranges together? And shared language creates this magical bridge that when we can see together and learn together and solve problems together, we can bring incredible creations into the world. So if you want to learn more, check out my book. It's on Lean Pub, Idea Flow. And I would also love to hear about your ideas. You can email at arty@dreamscale.io. And thank you. Questions?
So this was wonderful. Thank you so much. These kinds of talks are why I come to explore DDD. So this was great. I'm curious what your creative process looked like as you were putting together this talk and this theory. Like, what was your creative flow to get here? And you can take that up later if it's too long, if it's too much.
No, it's a great question. What was my creative flow to get here? I am an extremely visual thinker, obviously. And when I started down this road initially of measuring friction in the context of software development and looking for these patterns and studying friction and software development problem solving, I got really fascinated by brains. And so I read Jeff Hawking's book on intelligence, was the first book I read on cognitive science stuff, which is this model of the neocortex and this predictive processing engine and how it works. And Numenta has started this whole chain of AI-type research that's based on reverse engineering the neocortex as opposed to the machine learning, deep learning kind of approach. And they've done amazing research work in that. So I've been following a lot of their work at the same time that's, created a whole bunch of other tangents. But the thing that I find is that a lot of these ideas from different literature, you see similar geometry, similar shape, but an entirely different set of words and vocabulary. And so when we started seeing these similarities in these things that were in this wordless space, we started with trying to draw pictures of those things and giving those names and then having conversations with a bunch of made-up names. So the book of form that I mentioned with Michael Feathers, he's got 13 forms that are common in all kinds of systems, yet they're things that don't have names. And so he made up names and came up with definitions for, like, what are these different patterns? And what was fascinating about talking with him is he has a way of seeing the systems from the outside, and I have a way of seeing systems from the inside. So the way I think about it is like I'm debugging a machine, and I'm looking at all the observable effects and imagining what might the code look like? What might the machine look like that could produce this type of observable output? So my brain kind of synthesizes all the clues and builds machines, and he kind of sees the patterns on the outside, I see the inside. And so we had this amazingly productive feedback loop of talking about the systems from two different angles. And the convergence was essentially around similar geometry. And so I started drawing lots of pictures, and I have lots of tangents of lots of slides of different ideas of putting these things together, of breaking down humans of code and coming up with different models for this. But this is, I do lots of fun artwork and stuff because it amuses me. I like to draw. Any other questions?
Hey, thanks for the talk. That was fascinating. I was just wondering, how does facilitation factor into your model, and like how do, for example, artifacts on the wall and stuff that we leave there factor into the conversation?
That's an interesting question. So how do artifacts like stickies on the wall affect the conversation? So the way I think about any of these expressions that we have in different forms, whether it's writing, whether it's code, it's a medium for ideas that we can interact with. So I think about if there's a sticky on the wall that says a thing, that has some words on it, that when a person basically sees that idea concept, it basically triggers thoughts in their head. And so it's almost like these stickies are like pointers to little thoughts, right? And you might read that sticky and it points to a thought in your head, and someone else might read that sticky and it points to a slightly different thought in their head, right? And we can have these differences in our interpretation of the things that resonate with us, but all of these different artifacts, you can think of similar software as their idea sculptures or things that we can put ideas into that we can interact with later.
Can you get into describing a little bit more about the domain events that lead towards Discord, and how do you bring it back into together the accord?
So the domain events that lead to discord and the things that fix that. It's a challenging question. So one of the things I've noticed about humans and emotions is that when we have strong emotions, we tend to get sucked into our head and and it gets really difficult to see outside of this box that we just got sucked into. And it's really easy to walk into a situation where someone else is upset and freaking out and basically respond with being defensive and freaking out yourself. And what I found is if you can instead imagine what it's like, remember what it's like to feel like you're freaking out yourself, and then try and respond with being with that person, understanding why they're freaking out. Often you can kind of unwind the discord just by being able to be with them and be empathetic toward whatever their upsetness is, trying to understand. In general, when I find that people are upset, the thing they're craving or wanting is to be seen and understood. And if you respond with creating space for not necessarily agreeing with this person, but trying to understand their perspective, trying to understand what the underlying reason experience is that is leading them down that road. I got oranges, you got oranges. If we assume that whatever the reaction is that is happening is something that makes sense to that person in their head at that moment, and you just think of them like a software system that you're trying to understand and decode, you can kind of give them space and try and be with them in their place and put your own issues aside for a bit until you get that thing, get that person's thoughts heard. I'd say probably helps more than anything else I found when people are upset is try and help them to be seen and understood.
That was a fantastic talk.
Thank you.
I want you to talk a little bit more about that universal function. I've been reading a bit about the free energy principle, Carl Friston, neuroscientist, and it is kind of a universal function, a poetic license, that applies to all life at all scales.
Yeah.
Now, what do you have to say about the shape of that universal function?
Interesting, the shape. So in Numenta's research, they ultimately shifted from a model that was very hierarchical to one that was based off this concept of a cortical column that could model allocentric location. So for example, in the context of this room, I know where I am in space relative to this room. For this particular object remote, I can model this as a space, and I can think about what is the position of the button relative to this space. And each one of these models I can stitch together into a fabric to generate models from all of these combined ones. And all the experiences that I have in this room, walking around, looking at things, seeing different people, and kind of combine together so that you get a normalized center from all those experiences combined that become sort of the center prediction of what we expect to happen. And then all of the discord events, the unexpected things that happen, the violated predictions, those become kind of the high resolution things of when something goes wrong, we need to capture all kinds of detail because this is a weird situation, and if this ever happens, I need to recognize it so that I can avoid any kind of danger, right? So if I think about the combination of the allocentric location modeling with the normalizing centering around all experiences. So you imagine you're kind of dumping everything into one statistical bucket, and then you're keeping track of the differences of the outliers, that each one of these little units, you're measuring similarity and difference, And then you've got all these things stacked together at all of these different scales. And if I imagine memory as being associated with the relative wire as opposed to with the objects. So if I think about all these relative associations that have happened, and I treat that as where memories are stored, and I remember all of those relative associations and trigger that such that there are no objects, such that there is no spoon, then I think we can construct the entire emergent fabric out of wires, essentially, and have concepts, having objects, having things, recognizing things be this emergent effect based on noticing all of these relative shifts.
Okay. Thank everyone for coming. Thank you for Artemis.
Thank you.